Hi, everyone, and welcome to our final session of this three-part workshop on race with Dr. Brenda J. Allen. My name is Stephanie, and I am the event coordinator for Boulder Bookstore. And thank you all so much for signing up for this workshop and for being with us tonight. It is with your support and your book purchases that we can bring you things like this, so thank you so much. Professor Emerita Brenda J. Allen retired in April 2019 as the Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion and Professor of Communication at the University of Colorado, Denver, and the Anschutz Medical Campus. During almost 30 years at the university, Professor Allen developed a track record for scholarship, teaching, service, mentorship, and training. Among her numerous publications is a groundbreaking book entitled Difference Matters, Communicating Social Identity. She is working on a third edition. She also is developing a global online course on inclusive leadership for Coursera. All right, with all of that, over to you, Dr. Allen.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good evening, everyone. I am so pleased to be back again with you for the third night of Exploring Race Matters. And before I get started, I really want to give a special thanks to the Boulder Bookstore for this event, just to have the vision for it and then to provide phenomenal assistance along the way. It has absolutely been just so rewarding. I really appreciate it. And this evening, we are going to continue with taking a look back in terms of what we've shared already, and then going forward from there, excuse me one moment, in terms of the so what, now what. And I especially want to thank the owner of the Boulder Bookstore, Helena Boduc, for her vision for this series. She found me out of the blue and invited me to do this. And I'm so glad that I said yes. So as I said, we're going to continue what we've started, take a look at where we've been. First, we looked at what is race, and then why is race relevant to everyone? Today is so what, now what? And you see here what I'm planning for us for this evening. As usual, I would like for you to set your intention. And the reason I invite this is that I just believe if you have some clarity about what you're trying to do at any point in life, that can help guide how you do it and what you do. So once again, I also invite you to agree, to be open-minded and receptive. If I share something that you already know, ask yourself how and why being reminded might be valuable right now. Or something you didn't know that you feel skeptical about, suspend judgment. Ask yourself, hey, what if this is true? Or something you didn't know but receive as credible that evokes any type of emotion, frustration, guilt, shame, anger, sadness, fear. Be grateful that you care enough to be emotional. Some people could not care less about these topics. In fact, some of them have, they don't believe that they matter. They don't believe even that they exist. So one way to respond to your emotions is to become even more committed to affect change. Our guiding quote, once again, is from, oh, sorry about that, I had the wrong one. Our guiding quote will come up in a moment, but first, I want you, in addition to setting your intention, to, as you strive to achieve that attention, jot brief notes or keep track mentally and physically and emotionally of any examples or emotions that arise for you as we're sharing, as well as any insights or ideas in terms of, that since we're going to figure out what we're going to do next, and by the way, I'm in it with you, I'm going to have a plan for myself as well, then see if something provokes an idea for you or gives you that aha, hadn't thought of it like that way before. Because cultivating mindfulness and self-awareness, both of those are crucial for understanding and fighting racism. I hope that this technique will be useful for you. I want to pause for a moment this evening in terms of James Baldwin's quote that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. I believe that one of the challenges in terms of why it's taken so long for this country to have this momentary, and I'm concerned that it's momentary, lots and lots of people being concerned about race and racism. And part of it is because I think sometimes when, especially white people, get a sense of what it really is or could be, then they turn away. Then they say, oh no, that's too hard. So I just invite all of us to think about the significance of this quote. So for this evening, we start with so what? So what? We've looked at these different issues in terms of race as a social construction, racial disparities, types of racism, how we communicate about race and so forth. The question becomes, so what? What I'm going to do is move through some selected slides from our time together to highlight some so whats. So one of the key points is that race is a social and political construction. And in looking at that, I shared with you specifically two of the primary, actually, constructors, I guess I would call them, of race. And I want you to really look at on this slide. This is what Linnaeus wrote. According to what I've read, he was maybe the first person to actually define races by colors, which remains with us, right? Red and yellow, black and white. Now we have brown as another part of that color scheme. But look as well at the features and characteristics that he attributed. And look, for one, at how many more he has for black and how most of them are negative. Are all of them negative? Yeah. And how those kinds of stereotypes and assumptions about black people persist, even as, if you look at what he has for Americanus, red, right? Zealous, stubborn, painting himself with red lines, regulated by customs. For Asiaticus, severe, haughty, greedy, ruled by opinions. I mean, and then when you look at for white, primarily, I would discern as positive. So I just want you to just think about how powerful that is, and then look at the next person who was one of the key persons who constructed race, and how he basically declared, I've allotted the first place to the Caucasian because this stock displays the most beautiful race of men. From there, we took a look at how the US government, via the US Census, has helped to maintain and uphold race as a social and political construction that for the most part helps to maintain white supremacy. Even as at some points, I believe the US Census Bureau has genuinely tried to be understanding and responsive to what persons themselves, when it comes to race, what categories they might prefer. But this reflects structural and institutional racism within society. And if you didn't attend that first session, I strongly recommend that you do. And also this website is just phenomenal. The way this is set up, if you hover over the different shades and so forth there, things pop up that give you some background information. Remember, I asked you the other day, as you look across, if you recognize that each of the boxes is color coded for a racial identity that the Census Bureau requested. And I asked you then to see which colors are there any colors that you see across all of the time? And if you can recognize color, you'll see that it is orange and blue. That orange and blue represents black and white. And white was changed slightly only once. Versions of black have changed across time. I think that's also telling in terms of who got counted and how they got counted from the beginning of counting people in the United States. I also shared a wide variety of laws that demonstrate how legal institutions, how governments, city, state, the US government, et cetera, how they created laws typically for the convenience of white people. Typically because white people, either it was a matter of, okay, we can let you in so you can do work for us, or no, we don't want you anymore because you're taking our jobs, et cetera. This one was particularly striking for me, first of all, because I didn't even know about it. Second, and looking closely at it, you see a couple of things. First of all, as many as 1 million people of Mexican descent were forced or pressured to leave the United States. And as you see here, the term repatriation is inaccurate because approximately 60% of those driven out were actually US citizens. This event, carried out by American authorities, took place without due process. Moreover, what was significant about this is there were challenges in terms of work. And so one author contends that Mexicans and persons of Mexican descent and Mexicans were targeted for removal because of the proximity of the Mexican border. So that means it could be easy, right? The physical distinctiveness of the persons themselves, easy enough to like identify them. I think that's a key way that race has worked across the United States through color, right? And also because they lived in easily identifiable barrios. So also what happened at that time for the 1930 census, Mexican was used for the first and only time as a race category. So what happened then is, so I went back and looked at this yesterday. Why was it that just that one time? So some people say it's because that repatriation, they could figure out where these persons were and force them out. It turns out that the reason it was taken out is partially due to pressure from Mexican Americans, and the Mexican government. Pretty fascinating to me. Another point that I made is how important it is to understand that racial ethnic groups are heterogeneous, even as there's a tendency to lump us all together. And this particular category of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is extremely important because in many charts that share data, income, home ownership, wealth, etc., what happens is that oftentimes Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are at the top, even higher than white people in many cases. However, when you look at the data by origin, you see some stark differences. So even things like educational attainment, etc., neglect to show the stark differences between persons who are shown on this chart just in terms of income from the period of 2013 to 2015. So a key takeaway here is it's really important to understand heterogeneity and also to, anytime you're dealing with data, to disaggregate it, to parse it out in terms of a variety of groups. We also talked about the idea that exploring race matters, which is of course the theme of our session, our time together, that race is about a sense of identity and people vary widely, and a lot of it breaks down along group, actual racial group identity of whether or not it matters to them and how it matters to them. There are stark inequities and disparities that have persisted across time. So even though some of the things that we looked at were, their history, quote unquote, their impact is still being felt, and lots of egregious, embedded power, white supremacy behaviors are occurring, even as currently I believe that those have become even more evident and explicit. Genetics and science is something that, even though the Human Genome Project said that we are basically alike as humans, that has not seemed to help us move forward. And as I mentioned, one author who really cautions us about believing this notion of genetics is a thing of the past. And she cautions us in terms of being careful about DNA testing, being careful when it comes to medicines and so forth designed specifically for persons of color. Demographics, of course, matter greatly. And one demographic that I wasn't aware of until now is that the persons from Asian American and Pacific Island, that group is predicted to outpace in terms of numbers Latinx. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Of course, race matters because of civil rights. Moreover, the promise of racial diversity, what could really happen if we really were who we say we are. Recall that I shared with you on Wednesday the story of me seeing pictures in a newspaper box in St. Petersburg, Florida, and wondering what these men had done. And it was an example of me thinking under the influence of dominant belief systems that I've been socialized for. I just want you to know that my response wasn't out of the blue. That's what is important to know, that a key theme here is these issues are systemic. they're structural, they're institutional, and the only way forward is to disrupt those systems and structures and institutions. So that it was tied to ways that I had been socialized from a little girl in terms of colorism, from a little girl in terms of not even getting much education and experience to recognize, again, the heterogeneity among persons of Latin descent. And then at that moment, in terms of how newspapers and outlets tend to depict brown and Black men, as well as the schema in my mind of the little photos. I'm not saying this to excuse myself at all. I'm saying it to stress the point that we individually behave based on how structures have socialized us toward white supremacy. And speaking of that, we talked about racism being systemic, structural racism, institutional racism, internalized racism, personally mediated or interpersonal racism, anti-Black racism. And of all of the charts and data that I showed you, I decided as we do this quick review to highlight this one from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, because it is a brilliant example of structural racism and institutional racism. So you notice that who are more likely, right, in terms of the disproportionate cases compared to white non-Hispanic persons, Native Americans, Blacks, Hispanics, okay? And then in terms of deaths, you see those rates. I also would, again, go back to what happens in terms of Asian Americans. If we parse those data out, might we see some differences? That as the chart notes, race and ethnicity are risk markers for other underlying conditions that impact health. And I want you, as you look at these, to consider what are the institutions, what are the structures underlying socioeconomic status, access to health care, increased exposure to the virus due to occupation, that is being frontline essential and critical infrastructure workers. And in many cases, I would imagine almost having to choose between, do I expose myself and my family to illness, or do I not work and we can't eat? So I just want to stress this point about the systemic nature and about implications that go all the way back to, especially, particularly in the United States, of how it was designed and developed, and who was in charge and how the supremacist notions really prevailed and continue to prevail. So we're talking then about racial equity. And notice that means if one's racial identity no longer predicted in a statistical sense of how one fares. And so this means that we have to eliminate policies, practices, attitudes, messages, et cetera, that reinforce differential outcomes or fail to eliminate them. From there, we took a look at this notion of social identity. As you recall, that's one's sense of oneself based on belonging to or being perceived to belong to a particular group. And I talked and we explored that as group-oriented, membership, meaningful, identifiable, labeled, learned. And I invited you to think, could you list 25 social identity categories for yourself based on that definition? And I gave you my 25, and I probably could add about 10 more to them. I invite you to try this exercise and to as you try it, to understand that there's more to every single one of us than meets the eye, even as what meets the eye matters. So think about when you encounter someone for the first time, that each of you is a complex human being who has a wide variety of quote unquote identities to which you belong, a wide variety of things that matter to you, some of which within this society are much more likely to grant you privilege just by membership than others, some of which just by virtue of you being a member of that group to cause you to experience oppression, to be discriminated against, and even to anticipate that you might, which that in itself can take a toll. So as you think about this notion of who are you, recall that I shared with you intersectionality. And I shared it with you because I'm hearing people refer to intersectionality in ways that don't align with my understanding of it. It seems to me that sometimes when people talk about intersectionality, they're actually talking about overlapping identities, whereas this means they overlap with more than one non-dominant social identity category. And you saw a young woman who talked about how that mattered to her. So this matters because what happens then is it leaves one wondering, is it because I'm this, is it because of that, or is it because of that? So for me these days, the three primary are gender being woman, race being Black, and age being a senior citizen. Proud senior citizen, so yes, with my silver hair, not gray, don't you dare. So when you think about it then, there might be a situation in which I might wonder, was it because I'm older? Was it because I'm a Black older person? Is it because I'm a Black woman? Is it because I'm an older Black woman? And so this then contributes to a specific type of systemic oppression and discrimination that an individual might experience. Pretty fascinating if you haven't studied it, to think about the implications and also to think about how it all matters to your life. This evening, I want to share with you another person who will share with you her experiences. I will let her speak for herself.
My name is Judith LeBlanc. I'm an enrolled member of the Caddo Tribe of Oklahoma, and I'm the director of the Native Organizers Alliance.
Race and gender. Race and tribal sovereignty.
We're made to feel as though we're insignificant, we're disappearing, we're not an important voice. I think the struggle for our culture, our language, and being recognized as an important part of the fabric of the U.S. is critical to our identity. Indian people didn't have the right to vote in the United States, into the early 70s. I mean, states resisted giving Indians the right to vote. 2016 elections, there's a huge issue of voter access, voter suppression. American Indians face incredible obstacles to being able to vote. You have to drive sometimes 200 miles round trip in order to vote or even get registered to vote. It is so incredibly important that Indian country gets organized and is a part of the larger tables who are working on issues of concern for the whole country. If families decide they want to live in a city, they should be able to get health care, housing, and education as though they were living on an Indian reservation, to be guaranteed it. Now, I'm not able to speak my tribe's language. My mom was the last generation of people who did, but barely. My mom's generation was the boarding school generation. The connection to language, to the land, is critical in our identity. The further away you are from your language, the harder it is to maintain cultural traditions. The sovereignty that is inherently a part of every American Indian's outlook, whether you live in a city or on a reservation, has to be recognized. It's the only way forward. Many different tribes have very strong matriarchal societies, and traditionally women have played kind of a central role in the development of culture and traditions in a number of different tribes. But what we find, even in the 21st century, American Indian women face incredible levels of violence, domestic violence, violence on the streets. There are many, many missing women that the police departments in North America don't even bother to search for, and many unsolved murders. And a majority of the violence that Indian women and Native women face is from non-Native men. When you look at who's leading the social movements among Native peoples, women are playing a big role. On one level, yes, systemic racism has a huge impact on our lives. But on the other level, we're reacting, we're responding, and we're playing a big role in developing the solutions to the problems that Indian countries.
I apologize if that was cut off. She concludes that in terms of the significance of political movement and resilience and strength among her and others. Really fascinating. Again, that series is one I strongly recommend that you take a look at. We moved from intersectionality to looking at communicating race. And specifically, we looked at race labels, race in the media, everyday interactions, and racial dialogues. I want to share with you two additional things to think about in terms of communicating race. Also, remember that I shared with you, it seems to me oftentimes that white people don't even want to say the word race. They may say anything but that. But as I was thinking about it, I was remembering when I was younger, how my siblings and I would make fun of some of the older Black people in our family who would whisper white people when they said it. So it's this interesting thing in terms of whether or not to even say race or racial categories. Here's another issue related to race and communication. So this is Audre Lorde, phenomenal. If you're not familiar with her, she has just phenomenal scholar, as it says here, warrior poet. And she said here, I speak out of direct and particular anger at an academic conference, and a white woman says, tell me how you feel, but don't say it too harshly or I cannot hear you. But is it my manner that keeps her from hearing or the threat of the message that her life may change? This notion of tone policing is a tactic used by members of dominant groups to silence minoritized individuals by focusing on how it was said rather than the actual content. It can be policing for using tones that are quote unquote too angry when talking about racism, or by celebrating other persons of color for using more soothing tones. I have witnessed this in professional settings. It's really interesting, including a common reaction is to say that they feel attacked, or the language you're using is making me feel ashamed. Just think about, to ask someone to talk about pain without expressing emotions is not only unrealistic, but it is inhumane. And this attempt to center it back to whiteness is yet another example of white supremacy. One more thing, a couple of race labels to consider. One is BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. If you hear that phrase, it's a relatively new way to describe people of color in ways that, and for one, can acknowledge indigeneity, but also recognize Black, in this case, as really being clear about the notion of Blackness, as well as people of color in general. So that's BIPOC. Just as is the case for any labels and so forth, whether or not and how people understand and agree with them is going to vary widely. Another race label is Latinx. And Latinx is actually a gender-neutral name that's used instead of Latino or Latina, which reflect a gender binary. And it's very similar to other movements for gender neutral nouns, and to also acknowledge a gender spectrum. But notice here that most, and it's interesting that they say Latino adults, right? Most persons have in that racial ethnic group haven't heard of it, and few of them use it. The Pew Research Center provides some additional data, fascinating data in terms of who among the Latinx community actually use it. Then we talked a bit about racial dialogues and how they show promise for ways that interracial, cross-racial groups can begin to heal, and not only begin to heal, I would trust from that, actually work at breaking down structures, work at dismantling white supremacy. So that's it in terms of a so what, a look back with me pointing out a few things that I want you to especially take away. I wish we had time. I'd love to hear from you in terms of what you are taking away or have taken away. Now I'm going to actually send you all to breakout groups. And you're just going to have 3 minutes for a round robin. And that means introduce yourself, just your name, not your autobiography. I know some of y'all out there. Briefly share what has been most striking to you as part of this series. Don't elaborate, at least not yet. If everyone shares before the time is up, then feel free to talk among yourselves. Welcome back, everyone. So we're going to continue with, I hope that you had a great little discussion. We're now going to move. We're now going to move into the idea. Okay, now I'm ready. So we're now going to move into. All right, here we go. So now let's talk a bit about the questions that you all posed. And you had many of them. You all, I wish we could stick together because you had such good questions. So here are some of them that you asked. Third edition of Difference Matters. I just finished a major project, and so it's up next, and I trust it's going to get published next year. And for any of you who have been part of this event, if you listen carefully, if you send me an email and you put 3DM in the subject line, I will be sure to give you a copy of the third edition as soon as it's hot off the presses. So, and you'll see my email at the end of this presentation. I will give you a free copy of the third edition of Difference Matters. In the meantime, if you visit my website at the beginning of October, I'm going to really refresh it and update it with some of the information that stems from this experience, as well as other things that I have been doing. In terms of some of the other questions that were posed, resources on how to handle racial battle fatigue, I found some fascinating resources that are primarily on college campuses. And one of the key things I observed about that was that the resources should start with the institutions themselves trying to disrupt racism, as well as being thoughtful and open-minded and an understanding about what BIPOC students, faculty, and staff are facing. And that includes the kinds of counseling they provide, if they provide it at all. That includes looking at their policies, et cetera. So some of the pieces that I found, I appreciated that they went directly to structural, systemic, institutional issues. They also, however, talked about ensuring that students, and again, that was primarily the focus, but others talked about helping people in terms of their self-care. I would add to that to be sure this notion of type of self-care that is also culturally responsive. So that's an answer there. I want to go to this particular one quickly because we have a guest speaker, I guess I would say. So one person said that that person was unfamiliar with this term, and this was from an act that I presented on Monday. And another person said, in reference to the act, I feel that the name can be a teaching tool to the prevalence of overt racism in that time and how inappropriate it was, and to include the word and use it to teach us about how inappropriate it is. Then my good sister scholar, Dr. Deborah Wilcox, emailed me to say she wasn't sure of what I was talking about, but she says if a law has been given a specific name at a period of time in history, that is in fact the name of the law or policy. Example, Jim Crow laws. Black people may not like the term, but it was given that term to demarcate discriminatory and oppressive laws at that period in history. And she said, I hope my feedback is clear, and it is, my beloved sister. As a society, we cannot change the names of old historical laws and policies. Hopefully, as we move forward in this current social justice fight, that as a society, we will name contemporary laws and policies using inclusive and deserving names, such as the John Lewis Civil Rights Act of 2020. At this point, my also dear colleague, Dr. Archana Patik, Stephanie, is there a way that you can unmute or Archana, are you able to talk?
Yes, I can unmute.
Thank you, please. So Archana is going to share a few thoughts with us for a few minutes about this topic.
So the word coolie actually is a Hindi word, and it refers to people of lower caste who are usually unskilled labor. It has derogatory connotations about one's caste identity, one's cleanliness, and clearly one's access and rights into society based on caste identity. There's a huge movement throughout India that's been there for a very long time, but has resurfaced, similarly to racism in the United States, that looks at casteism and pushing back and creating anti-caste moves. And so when Dr. Allen and I talked about this word and the use of this word, my response to her was that I am of an upper caste. I am Brahmin. And so I am positioned similarly to the ways in which white people are positioned in US society when it comes to race. And so whether or not this word is appropriate or not isn't something that I get to decide. This is a word that has been used to dehumanize castes of people in my society. And they're the ones who get to tell me how I use that language or don't use that language. It's not a word I would ever use. And even though I know I said it just now to define it, it's important to me and in my own community that I push back on those of us who identify as upper caste from ever using it, even to explain its negative connotations.
Thank you so much. And colleagues, I hope you can see what this demonstrates. First of all, thank you for the education, every single one of you who contributed to this. And it demonstrates the complexities of naming, demonstrates the complexities of identities, as well as the hierarchies that are in place. And I would say there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. What matters is conversation. What matters for me typically is I'm going to lean more towards the persons or groups in the non-dominant position. So you had other fabulous questions that I don't have time to address because I really want to get to some time for you all to develop some of your own action plans, but please know that I have thought about them and have some ideas. Some of them are really hard questions. For instance, is it possible to create a post-racial world? And someone else talked about, wow, how embedded these systems are of white supremacy. Can we disrupt them? I say we've got to try. I'm sure it's not going to happen in my lifetime, but we've got to keep on trying. And this one about when I was a teacher, a person said the platinum rule didn't work with the girl who was the object of racist comments, but said she didn't mind. I said, I minded that it's not okay to put people down, period, and especially not racist comments. So to this idea of the platinum rule, do unto others as they would have you do unto them. It's like any other tool or technique. You want to use it according to the situation, not something that you use all the time. And in this case, it seems to me very similar to what I was saying earlier, that, you know, some people, it's okay if you call them or you say the N-word around them. To me, it is unacceptable. And in situations where I am, where I have any authority, it won't be used. So I appreciate the comment, and thinking about these issues reminds us that they are very, very complex. So now what? First, there's some recommendations at the institutional level. So if you're part of any institutions or organizations, this is important for you to understand. It's gotta be, anti-racism has to be a priority as we have defined it here, as well as racial equity. And you must take a strategic approach using SMART method. Some of you know this: specific, measurable, achievable, reliable, and realistic, and time-bound. So it's got to be strategic and analyzing data, but also getting qualitative insight and input. Identify and implement best practices. The good news, there's lots of best practices out there now. For one is the racial equity framework, and I'm going to show you, I believe the next slide is a website that I really, really love. It's a wonderful website, has a wealth of resources. And as institutions do it, they've got to provide all kinds of resources. Budget, training. Professional development is essential. Education is essential. Most people just don't know and understand these issues. I love that I get to educate people, to try to empower and encourage them. And that keeps me learning and growing as well. They also have to have time to do it. And this needs to Everybody needs to be involved and included. Everyone needs to be involved, not just BIPOC people, not just other members of non-dominant groups, and it needs to be across the hierarchy, starting with leadership. Finally, requiring accountability from everyone. But I think you have to provide, you have to give them what they need to succeed and then expect for them to be accountable. So this is one of the websites. I love Racial Equity Tools website. You see here, if this is just a screenshot, you scroll down the tools that they have for organizational change processes. But good luck in finding an organization that really is going to take it on. That's the challenge. So recommendations for you at the individual level. Take personal responsibility. And that's, I don't care, well, I do care what your race or ethnicity is. What I'm saying is, this is for all of us. This is for every single one of us. We all can stand to grow and learn individually, collectively. So taking personal responsibility, being much more mindful and heartfelt. As some have said, including Dr. Kendi, unless you're working to eradicate racism, you're helping to perpetuate it, regardless of your own racial identity. So try to be aware of your behaviors, attitudes, et cetera. Be honest with yourself, be curious, educate yourself. There's a wealth of resources. Work within your sphere of influence, both personally and professionally, within your family, friends, et cetera. And as I said, the platinum rule, and as again, as the case with any tools and so forth, use accordingly. I say, however, really kind of lean towards understanding if you think, well, it would be okay for me if somebody did this thing, and if somebody else is saying it's not okay for them, then minimally say, respect their right or their position on that. Optimally, try to really understand, especially when it's related to members of non-dominant oppressed groups. So from there, I have a couple of recommendations for you. One is Me and White Supremacy. I actually kind of speed read it last night, and I love it. Layla Saad is a British social media figure and author. After starting an Instagram trend of hashtag Me and White Supremacy, she first developed it into a digital free workbook. Then it was published in 2020. And it really it's designed for white people. And she talks directly and provides examples. It's a 28-day program. Highly, highly recommended. She wants to be a good ancestor, so she's doing this work in that regard. And she invites white people from now on in terms of what you do to also be a good ancestor. And I actually heard from one of my awesome former students, forever friend, phenomenal activist, Chantel Lewis, that she's also striving to be a good ancestor. I actually heard it from her first, then I heard it from Layla Saad. So that's something to think about. Then there is Mindful of Race by Ruth King. And this book, I'm both listening to it and reading it. And I love how it takes this notion of mindfulness. This is her practice. This is what she is dedicated to. And she has put this in the framework of Buddhist perspectives and mindfulness. And she also, similar to Layla Saad, talks in the first person about her own experiences and then guides us through meditation and other practices. Finally, there is Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask by Dr. Anton Troyer, who's an American academic and author. This book is one that my dear colleague, I mentioned before, Gracie Redshirt Tyon, who is Oglala Lakota, this is one that she recommended. And actually, she's my go-to person for anything about Native Americans, American Indians, Indigenous people, because I totally trust and respect her in terms of helping me to understand contemporary issues. So now it's time for you to develop a personal action plan. And I want you to reflect on this as we have about 5 minutes left. And here are 3 questions for you to consider. First of all, how will you be? How will you be? And that refers to what attitudes, what characteristics, how self-aware will you be, how open-minded, curious, etc. So that's what I'm looking for you to think about in that particular section. How will you be as you strive to to fight against racism, to be anti-racist? How will you approach, how will you live, how will you act, how will you feel? The second is, what will you learn? What is it that you want to really pay attention to, not just pay attention to, but actually become more knowledgeable about? And finally, what will you do? What will you do? Of course, you don't have time to finish that right now, but that's the approach that I want you to take as you think about a personal action plan. And as you think about that personal action plan, please remember that while it is so important for us to work on an individual level, to work with ourselves, in fact, I think it's important to start with self. What's particularly critical is that as we do that, perhaps as we heal, perhaps as we learn, perhaps as we come together with friends, colleagues, allies, and so forth on more of a personal level, we also are preparing ourselves and along the way to actually do things within the systems in which we operate, where we have some sphere of influence. So that's what I recommend for you in terms of your action plan. And I want to now wrap with one more short video.
The sound isn't playing.
Okay, let me go back out. Let's see what happens here. Can you hear it now?
No, I think you have to, when you have to choose from the menu at the top, use the audio from play.
Well, that's okay. That I apologize for that. I had tried it earlier and I somehow neglected to click back on when I think when I came back from the breakout rooms. However, I will send you the link. What I love about the quote is that he speaks specifically to this idea of the beloved community. And that's what I believe our work can do, that we can become that beloved community. I thank you again so much for taking the time to join us for this series. I'm so grateful for how much I've learned, how much more empowered I feel, even as I have had moments of so many different emotions as I'm digging deeper into the history. The good news is that that history is really out there. The internet is phenomenal. And one of the things I'm going to be doing, I promise you all, is I'm curating this information. And if you value my perspectives at all, then I encourage you to check out differencematters.info in October. You can check it out now because it has some pretty good stuff, but it's a little dated and I'm excited to do more. And on that note, I want to thank you again very much and wish you nothing but the best as you strive to become the beloved community. And as the esteemed John Lewis would say, get in some good trouble. Thank you all so very much. Peace.